The day I walked across that stage and got my diploma, there were exactly 2 empty seats where my parents were supposed to be sitting. I had circled those seats with a yellow highlighter on the seating chart the university sent out 3 weeks before the ceremony. I had texted my mother the arena address twice, once in April and again in early May, just to make sure she had it saved. I had asked my father, the last time we talked on the phone, if they were going to make the drive from Raleigh, and he said, "Of course, Emma. We wouldn't miss it." I believed him. I always believed him. That was the problem. My name is Emma Mack. I'm 26 years old, and I grew up in North Carolina in a house where love was something that got handed out unevenly, like the last piece of food on the table that always somehow ended up on someone else's plate. I didn't understand that for a long time. Children rarely do. You spend years thinking you must be doing something wrong, that if you just tried harder, smiled more, asked for less, eventually the balance would shift in your favor. I spent 25 years doing exactly that. And then, on a Saturday morning in May, standing alone in a rented graduation gown with a rolled-up piece of paper in my hand, I finally understood that the balance was never going to shift, not because I wasn't enough, but because the scale had been broken from the start. This is the story of how I figured that out and what I did about it. If you're new here, please subscribe. It helps the channel grow and reach more people. Now, let's get started. I should start by telling you about Derek. Derek is my brother. He's 23 years old, 3 years younger than me, and from the time he was about 7, he occupied a space in our family that I can only describe as central. Everything orbited him. Family dinners circled around whatever sport he was playing that season. Vacations were planned around his school schedule, even when mine was different. When the two of us needed something at the same time, a ride, a signature on a form, a parent to show up somewhere, Derek's thing was always the one that got handled first. And more often than not, mine got handled whenever there was time left over, which wasn't often. I want to be careful here, because I'm not telling this story to make Derek sound like a villain. He was just a kid, the same as I was. He didn't ask for the preferential treatment any more than I asked to go without it. The truth is that my parents made their choice quietly, without announcing it, probably without fully realizing they were making it. They just found Derek easier to pour themselves into. He was louder, more demanding. He called more, needed more, leaned more. And my parents, whether out of exhaustion or habit or something else I still don't entirely understand, responded to the loudest voice in the room. I happened to have a quieter one. Growing up, I learned to take care of things myself. When I needed school supplies, I figured out what I could get on my own. When I had a problem at school, I worked through it without asking them to call a teacher. When I got into college, the first person in our family to do so, I researched every scholarship available, filled out every application, did every financial aid form on my own at the kitchen table while my mother drove Derek to soccer practice. They were proud of me. I know they were. My mother told people at church. My father mentioned it to his coworker, but the pride lived at a distance, like something they admired from across the room without walking over to touch it. I told myself that was fine. I told myself I was independent, self-sufficient, that I didn't need the same kind of attention Derek needed, and that was actually a good thing about me, a strength, something to be proud of. And maybe part of that was even true. But a larger part of it was just a story I had learned to tell myself so that the loneliness didn't feel quite so heavy. The first time I remember feeling it clearly, not just as a vague background ache, but as something with edges, something I could point to. I was 15 years old. My school had a winter recital. I was in the choir, had been for 2 years, and this particular year I had a small solo. 12 measures, maybe 40 seconds of actual singing. But it was the first time I had ever been given anything like that, and I had practiced those 12 measures until I could have sung them in my sleep. I told my parents weeks in advance. I reminded them the week of. I reminded them the morning of. That same evening, Derek had a regional soccer qualifier. He was 12. It was a middle school game. My parents went to the game. I sang my 40 seconds to a section of empty chairs where they were supposed to be sitting, and afterward, when I came home still in my concert clothes and found my mother heating up leftovers and my father watching the post-game recap on television, neither of them said anything about it. My mother asked if I was hungry. My father said Derek had scored a goal. That was the whole conversation. I went to my room, sat on the edge of my bed, and told myself it wasn't a big deal. 12 measures, 40 seconds, not worth making a scene over. I was practical, mature, understanding. I understood that these things happen, that schedules conflict, that they had tried their best. I think about that 15-year-old version of myself sometimes. I think about how quickly she learned to swallow things, how good she got at it over the years. Swallowing disappointment until it just became the baseline, until she stopped even noticing she was doing it. College changed things somewhat in the way that distance always does. When you're not in the same house as something, it's easier to stop feeling its weight so directly. I went to school at UNC Asheville, about 4 hours from Raleigh, and I threw myself into the experience the way someone does when they're trying to build a life that feels like it belongs to them. I made friends. I found a major I cared about. Communications, with a focus on media production. I had professors who noticed when I turned in something good and said so directly to my face, and I realized, maybe for the first time, what it felt like to be seen by someone who wasn't obligated to see you. I called home less than I probably should have, not out of spite, just out of necessity. There was always something happening, always something to study or prepare or attend, and the calls home were pleasant enough, but they followed a predictable pattern. My mother would ask if I was eating. My father would ask if everything was okay. And then, almost without fail, the conversation would drift toward Derek. His grades, his games, some situation at school that needed handling, some expense that had come up unexpectedly. I would listen, make appropriate sounds of acknowledgement, and hang up feeling the same low-grade hollowness I had always felt, the one I had become so practiced at ignoring. What I didn't fully register at the time was how one-directional those calls always were. I was 20 years old, living alone in a new city, navigating a university and a budget and a social life, and every other complicated thing that comes with being young and far from home. But my parents never asked about any of that in any depth. They never said, "Tell me about your week," in a way that suggested they actually wanted the answer. They called to maintain a connection, to check a box, to be able to say they had called, and I, as always, made it easy for them by keeping my answers short and not asking for anything more. Junior year was the hardest financially. I had cobbled together my funding through a combination of scholarships, grants, a part-time job at the campus media center, and a small student loan I had taken out reluctantly. For 2 years, the balance had been manageable, but junior year, one of my scholarship grants wasn't renewed, a bureaucratic issue with an oversight committee that my advisor couldn't resolve in time, and suddenly there was a gap in my budget that I couldn't cover with what I was making at the media center. I called home. This was not something I did easily. I had spent 3 years deliberately not asking my parents for money, not because they had told me not to, but because I understood intuitively that asking would feel like an imposition, and because I didn't want to give them any reason to look at me the way I had seen them look at Derek when he called asking for something, with a kind of weary resignation, like love that had curdled slightly at the edges. I wanted their good opinion more than I wanted their money. But the gap was real, and I didn't have another option. My mother answered. I explained the situation clearly and calmly, the way I explained everything without drama, with all the relevant numbers and a clear request. I needed a loan, not a gift, a loan, with a repayment plan I had already thought through. $400 a month for 4 months, and I would be back on solid ground. There was a pause on the line. My mother said she would talk to my father. 3 days later, my father called back. He explained, gently but firmly, that money was tight. Derek had just signed up for a travel soccer camp that summer. A real opportunity, they said, a serious program, the kind of thing that could open doors for him. The deposit had already been paid. What was left in savings was reserved for emergencies. I asked, as carefully as I could manage, whether a gap in my university funding counted as an emergency. There was another pause. He said he was sorry. He said he knew it was hard. He said he believed in me and knew I would figure it out. I thanked him, said goodbye, hung up, and sat for a long time in the silence of my apartment. Then I went online, found a second part-time job at a coffee shop 2 blocks from campus, and figured it out. I always figured it out. By the time I reached my senior year, I had built something I was genuinely proud of. My GPA was strong. I had landed an internship at a media company in Charlotte that everyone in my program wanted, and I had gotten it not through connections or luck, but through a portfolio I had spent 2 years building piece by piece. My faculty advisor had written me a recommendation letter she described when she handed it to me as the best one I've written in 11 years. I had made friends who felt like real ones, the kind that called to check on you and remembered the things you had told them and showed up when you needed them to. I had also, somewhere in those 4 years, quietly stopped expecting my parents to be those people. Not with bitterness, exactly. More like someone who has learned the shape of a room so well they no longer bump into the furniture. I knew what my parents could offer and what they couldn't, and I had arranged my life accordingly. What I hadn't done was look at the whole picture honestly. I hadn't let myself add it all up. The graduation changed that. The ceremony was on a Saturday in early May. The arena seated 4,000 people, and it was loud and chaotic and full of balloons and families in good clothes pressing through the corridors. I found my place in the procession line with the rest of the communications graduates, and I kept checking my phone because I had told my parents to text when they arrived, so I could wave to them from the stage. No texts came. I thought maybe they were running late. Traffic from Raleigh could be unpredictable. I told myself they would be there when I walked across the stage, that I would look up and see them standing in the crowd with their phones raised, the way parents do. I walked across the stage. I shook the dean's hand. I accepted my diploma. I looked out at the crowd. 2 empty seats with yellow highlighter marks on the seating chart I had sent 3 weeks earlier. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that. Standing on that stage in front of 4,000 people, I was not the kind of person who cried publicly. And even in that moment, some part of my brain was still operating in the mode I had always operated in. The mode that assessed, adapted, moved forward. I took my diploma. I walked off the stage. I found my friends in the crowd and hugged them and took photos and smiled in all of them. And in every photo from that day, I looked genuinely happy, because in some real way, I was. The call came that evening. My mother's voice was warm and cheerful when she picked up. She asked how the ceremony had gone, told me she was sorry they hadn't made it. And then, before I could say anything, she said that Derek's birthday party had gone beautifully. They had rented a pavilion at a park near the house. There had been a catered barbecue. 30 of Derek's friends had come. It had been, she said, such a special day. I remember holding the phone and listening to her talk about the catered barbecue and the 30 friends and the special day, and feeling something settle in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. Something that had been hovering at the edges for years, finally landing. "I'm glad," I said. And I meant it in a way that probably surprised her. Not sarcasm, not cold politeness, but a kind of clear, quiet recognition. Something had become undeniable. I was glad, in the strange way you're glad when you finally stop pretending something isn't true. We talked for another few minutes. She said they were proud of me. I said thank you. We said goodbye. I put the phone down and sat with what I was feeling, and for the first time in my life, I let myself feel it without immediately filing it away somewhere. I let myself see it plainly. They had planned his birthday party for the same day as my graduation, not accidentally. The graduation date had been announced in February. I had told them in February. The party had been planned and catered and attended by 30 people. It had been a choice, the same way all of it had always been a choice. The soccer game over the recital, the soccer camp over my university gap, every phone call that ended talking about Derek instead of asking about me. It was a long pattern, and I had spent 25 years finding ways to explain it away, to soften it, to tell myself I was reading too much into it, or being too sensitive, or expecting too much. I was done explaining it away. The next few weeks were quiet ones. I finished out the semester, packed up my apartment, and started thinking about what came next. The internship had gone well enough that the company in Charlotte had mentioned a possible entry-level position opening in the fall. I could stay in North Carolina, find an apartment in Charlotte, continue doing what I had been doing, building a life in the background, making myself useful to the people around me, asking for nothing. Or I could do something different. I had a college friend named Priya who had moved to San Francisco the previous year to work at a digital production company. She texted periodically with photos of the bay and complaints about the cost of avocados. And once, during a late-night phone call, she had said, "You'd love it here, Emma. There's so much going on. You should just come." I had laughed it off at the time because that's what you did with impractical suggestions from people who were already on the other side of an impractical leap. But the idea had stayed somewhere at the back of my mind, quiet but present. I started looking at job postings in California. Within 2 weeks, I had sent applications to 11 companies. Within 3 weeks, I had 3 callbacks. The strongest one was from a media production firm in San Francisco that worked primarily on documentary and long-form content, the exact kind of work I had built my portfolio around. The hiring manager emailed to schedule a video interview on a Thursday afternoon. The interview lasted 45 minutes and covered everything from my technical skills to my editorial judgment to how I approached a project when the direction wasn't fully defined. I answered every question honestly, without performing, and when it was over, I thought, I would want to work with someone who interviewed like that. They offered me the position 12 days later. I accepted before I had figured out the details. Telling my parents was not a conversation I dreaded exactly, but it was one I had thought about carefully because I knew enough about how they processed information to know that Emma is moving to California would be received primarily as information about how it affected them, not as information about Emma. I called on a Sunday evening. My mother answered first, and I asked her to put my father on as well so I could tell them both at once. I kept it simple. I had accepted a job in San Francisco, a good job, the kind I had been working toward. I was excited about it. I was moving in 6 weeks. The silence that followed was the particular kind of silence that isn't actually empty. It's full of things people are deciding not to say. My mother broke it first. She said she didn't understand why I couldn't just take the job in Charlotte, that San Francisco was so far, that she didn't know anyone out there. My father asked if I had really thought it through. He said it seemed sudden. He said he wasn't sure it was the right decision. Neither of them asked about the job itself. Not the company, not the work, not what I would be doing there. Not whether I was scared or excited, or both. My mother mentioned at some point during the conversation that they had been hoping I might move back to Raleigh for a while, that it would be nice to have me closer to home, that Derek had been talking about wanting to get out of his current apartment, and maybe the two of us could find a place together. I noted that without saying anything about it. When the conversation had run its natural course and there was nothing left to say, my father said, "Well, okay, take care of yourself." My mother said, "I hope it works out." That was the send-off. Okay, and I hope it works out. No, we love you, or we're proud of you, or let us know if you need anything. Just, okay, and I hope it works out. I said thank you, said goodbye, and felt, in some way I wouldn't fully understand until later, that those words were exactly right. That okay and I hope it works out were the most honest thing they had ever said to me, because they were saying it without the layer of performance that usually accompanied their affection, without the pretense that they had been as present as they should have been. It was bare, minimal, true. I hung up and started making a packing list. I want to tell you about the drive out, because it matters to the story. I didn't fly. I drove in my 7-year-old Honda Civic with a trunk full of boxes and a back seat packed to the ceiling, across 4 days and roughly 2,800 miles, from Raleigh through Tennessee and Arkansas and Texas and New Mexico and Arizona, and finally into California. I had done the route planning myself, booked the motels myself, driven every mile myself. No one offered to come with me, and I didn't ask anyone to. The first day was hard in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not because anything went wrong. The car ran fine, the roads were clear, the weather was cooperative. But there is something about driving away from the place where you grew up, watching the landscape you have known your whole life recede in the rearview mirror, that makes the weight of a decision suddenly very real. I had made a lot of decisions in my life quietly and alone. This one felt different. This one felt like a door. By the second day, something had shifted. I was in Tennessee, and the mountains came up around the highway in a way that felt enormous and impersonal, and somehow freeing, because enormous and impersonal things have a way of putting smaller things in perspective. I stopped at a diner outside Knoxville and ate pancakes at a counter and talked briefly with the woman who refilled my coffee about where I was headed, and she said, "California, good for you." Just that. Good for you. I drove the rest of the afternoon thinking about those 3 words. By the 4th day, crossing into California on Interstate 40 through the Mojave Desert in the early afternoon light, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly, though happiness was part of it. Clarity. The particular clarity that comes when you have finally made the decision you were always going to make, and the making of it strips away all the noise that surrounded it. I reached San Francisco on a Thursday evening, drove across the Bay Bridge with the city spread out ahead of me, and found the apartment I had rented sight unseen on the 3rd floor of a building in the outer Sunset neighborhood, with a view of a row of pastel-painted houses, and on a clear day, a sliver of ocean. I carried my boxes up the stairs myself. I put my bed frame together at midnight with a YouTube tutorial and a set of borrowed tools. I ordered pizza and ate it sitting on my living room floor surrounded by cardboard, and I looked around at the empty apartment that was mine, only mine, and felt something settle in my chest, like something putting itself back in place. The first months in San Francisco were, in the plain factual sense, difficult. New city, new job, new rhythms, new everything. The production company where I worked moved fast and expected a lot, and there were days in those early weeks when I came home, tired in a way that went all the way down to the bone. I was also lonely in that specific way that new cities produce, surrounded by people but not yet by anyone who knew me, navigating the slow work of building a life from scratch. But I want to be precise about the quality of that loneliness, because it was different from the loneliness I had grown up with. The loneliness of my childhood was the kind that came from being unseen by people who were supposed to see you. It was the loneliness of being in a full house and still having no one to tell your news to. It was quiet and familiar, and in the worst way, comfortable. The kind of loneliness you stop noticing because it has just become the air. The loneliness of those early months in San Francisco was the active kind, the kind that comes from being in a new place, not yet settled, not yet known, working towards something. That kind of loneliness has direction in it. It's temporary by nature. It's the loneliness of building, not of being left behind. I could tell the difference, and the difference mattered. I started making friends the way adults make friends when they actually try. Slowly, through repeated exposure and gradually lowering guards. A woman at my office named Jordan who brought in coffee for the whole team on Fridays and had opinions about documentary editing that were sharp and well considered and that I enjoyed arguing with. A neighbor named Hector who was retired and kept a small vegetable garden on the building's shared rooftop, and who, once he understood that I wasn't going to just walk past him every morning without saying hello, turned out to be surprisingly good company. A friend of Priya's named May, who had grown up in the Bay Area and had the particular knowledge of a place that only comes from having lived there long enough to know where things actually were, as opposed to where apps said they were. These people did not owe me anything. They had not known me for years, but they showed up in the small, daily ways that matter. A text when they thought of something I might like, a recommendation for a good walk when I mentioned I was stressed, the basic and undervalued act of remembering what you had said the last time you talked. I had spent so much of my life being grateful for crumbs from people who should have given me more. It took me a while to recognize what actual nourishment felt like. Work was going well, not easily. Good work rarely comes easily, but well. My manager, a woman named Christine, had a way of giving feedback that was direct without being unkind, and I responded to that the way a plant responds to actual light after a long time in a dim corner. She told me, 6 weeks in, that my instincts for story structure were stronger than those of people who had been doing the work for years. I wrote that down and looked at it for a while. I was, for the first time in my adult life, living in a way that felt like mine. The call came on a Thursday afternoon, about 6 months after I had moved. I was at my desk when my phone buzzed with my mother's name. I had spoken to my parents occasionally since leaving, brief, polite exchanges that covered the basic facts of each other's lives without going deeper than that. My mother would ask if I liked California. I would say yes. She would mention the weather in Raleigh. I would say that sounded nice. We were cordial in the way that people are cordial when they have decided, without announcing it, that the former terms of a relationship no longer apply. I answered. The first minute of the conversation was the usual warm-up. How was I doing? How was the job? How was California? And then my mother said, in a tone that was careful in a way that telegraphed exactly what was coming, that she and my father had been talking and that Derek had decided he wanted to move to California. Derek had decided he wanted to live in the Bay Area. Derek needed somewhere to stay. Derek could stay with me, she said, while he got settled, just temporarily, just until he found his footing. They would help with groceries. It wouldn't be for long. I listened to all of this and felt very calm. I thought about my apartment, which had 2 rooms, the bedroom that was mine and the living room that I had slowly, over 6 months, arranged into something that felt like a reflection of who I actually was. Books I had chosen for myself, a small collection of prints from artists I had found at a street market, a corner where I kept my camera equipment, organized the way I needed it to be organized, a life that I had built, piece by piece, without anyone's help. I thought about what it would mean to hand a piece of that over to the brother who had always, without malice, but also without awareness, taken up more than his share of every available resource in the room. I thought about my parents, who had planned a birthday party on the day of my graduation, who had chosen a soccer camp over a gap in my university tuition, who had said, when I left for California, "Okay, and I hope it works out." And I thought about how I'd spent 25 years making myself small enough to fit into whatever space was left over after everyone else had taken theirs. "No," I said. My mother paused. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean, I can't do that," I said. "I'm sorry, but I can't." She started to explain it again, more slowly, as if I had misunderstood the logistics. I let her finish. Then I said, as clearly and without anger as I could manage, that I had spent a long time making things easier for everyone else at the cost of my own stability, and that I wasn't going to do it anymore. Not out of hostility, not because I didn't love my family, but because I had finally, after a long time, built a life that felt like mine, and I was not going to dismantle it to solve a problem that wasn't mine to solve. My mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said in a small voice that she didn't know I felt that way. I said gently, that I knew she didn't, and that was part of the problem. We stayed on the phone for a few more minutes, not quite knowing what to do with the honesty that had just entered the conversation. It was unfamiliar territory for both of us. My mother said she'd have to talk to my father. I said that was fine. I said I hoped Derek found a good place to land. I meant that, too. When we said goodbye, it was quieter than usual. Not cold, quiet. I put the phone down. There was no dramatic fallout after that call, no screaming match, no estrangement, no ultimatum. My parents were not cruel people. They had not made their choices with malicious intent. They had simply, over the course of 26 years, made their priorities clear through the accumulated weight of 1,000 small decisions, and the clearest thing I could do in return was make mine clear as well. We still talked. Less frequently than before, but we talked. My mother called on my birthday and on holidays. My father occasionally forwarded news articles he thought I might find interesting. That was his version of reaching out, and I had learned to receive it as such. Derek eventually moved to Portland, not California, and found work at a landscaping company, and seemed, from the limited view I had of his life through my mother's updates, to be figuring things out. I didn't feel anger toward him. I never really had. Anger requires a specific kind of investment in what might have been, and I had too much of what actually was to spend much time on what might have been. What I had was this. A morning in February, about 8 months after the call with my mother, when I woke up in my apartment to the sound of rain on the window and the particular gray-gold light that San Francisco produces when it's overcast and the city is still quiet. I made coffee. I sat down at my small kitchen table with my notebook and my mug. Through the window, I could see the row of pastel houses, their colors muted in the rain. Down the street, the bakery that opened at 6:30 would already have its lights on. I had a project meeting at 10 that I was genuinely looking forward to. We were developing a long-form documentary about 3 women who had rebuilt their lives after losing everything, and I had spent the past 2 weeks deep in interview footage that was some of the most honest material I had ever worked with. Christine had told me the week before that the executive team wanted me to take the lead on the editorial direction. It was the kind of opportunity that came when people had watched you closely and decided you were ready. I had dinner plans that evening with Jordan and Hector and May and a few others at a restaurant in the Mission that May had been insisting on for weeks. Nothing special, just dinner. I sat there with my coffee and looked at the rain and felt the quietness of the morning and noticed, without making a ceremony of it, that the quietness was not lonely. It was just quiet, the good kind, the kind that belongs to you. I thought briefly about the graduation, the empty seats, the rolled diploma, the phone call about catered barbecue and 30 friends, and a special day. I thought about the 15-year-old version of myself singing 40 seconds to empty chairs. I thought about the drive across the country, crossing into California in the afternoon light with the desert stretched out on both sides and the city somewhere ahead. And then I stopped thinking about it, because there was coffee to drink and a project I cared about waiting for me, and the bakery down the street would have the good almond croissants on a rainy day, and I had exactly enough time to walk down and get one before I needed to start getting ready. I put on my coat, I picked up my keys. I stepped out into the rain. The street was wet and cold and bright in the way that streets are bright after rain, when everything reflects the light back at you from unexpected angles. I walked down the block with my hands in my pockets, not hurrying, just walking. A woman I didn't know was walking a very large dog in the opposite direction, and the dog paused to look at me with the solemn, evaluative gaze that large dogs have. And I stopped for a moment and let him sniff my hand, and the woman smiled and said good morning, and I said good morning back. It was a Tuesday in February, and I was 26 years old, and I was walking to get a croissant in a city I had chosen for myself, on my way to work I had earned, to meet people who had come to matter to me. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.